Okay, so another question po, no, why is it important and how is it important for a Christian to admit and accept, to honestly say that I am struggling with something? Gaano po ka-importante yun?
We usually hear the word denial, right? Yeah. So, denial is actually a way of coping, what we call like a defense mechanism. And sometimes we just don't deny by saying, no, I don't have a problem. Well, I may have a problem, but it's small compared to somebody else's problem. Minimizing, right? Or talking about somebody else's problem rather than mine, right? Yeah, so iba-ibang klase ng defense mechanism, So the first step really in asking for help is acknowledging, accepting that you have a problem. Pinakamahirap yan, lalo na pagkasanay tayo, yung mga taga Bahrain, o yung mga OFWs, o yung mga immigrants, no? Kami sa US, ang dami natin mga pinagdaanan, kaya natin lahat, diba? So bakit ako magkakaproblema? Right? I can handle this, I can manage this, I can deal with it. Yun naman siguro sa Pilipinas, depende sa audience natin, siguro ganyan din tayo, diba? Pagka may problema tayo, kaya ko naman So admitting that we have a problem is the hardest thing to do. So when people come to see me, I always encourage them. I affirm them. I say, you know what? You've taken the first huge step in getting a solution for your problem, which is asking for help.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
And I think we also have to correct our Christian culture, which is actually the root bakit nagtatago yung mga Christians about what they feel or what they are experiencing, because we have this culture na we also dismiss. We're not supposed to be feeling that way, ganyan. So nagtatago po yung feelings. Pastor Jojo?
Yeah, I think what we should be sensitive to there is yung narrative to which we are, being exposed. Kasi oftentimes, yung counseling natin, storya niya yun. Pero for example, if he or she's engaged in a relational conflict situation, there are always two sides to a story, So, ako very careful ako dyan kasi sometimes, the counselee, even though he says he's trying or she's trying to be honest, is actually putting up a smoke screen, trying to, put his or her best foot forward, pero actually, the more kind of negative things about him or her, sinusuppress niya yun. And that can only be revealed if you actually validate yung kanyang narrative with the narrative of the person that he or she may be conflicted with, right? So I think we should be discerning enough to listen and at the same time sort through all these defense mechanisms that Dr. Lilia mentioned, and also yung attempt niya to sometimes, hindi siya sometimes aware na dinedeceive niya actually sarili niya. Na actually part din siya ng problem. Kasi sometimes ang ginagawa niya ay nag-gaslight siya in terms of blaming the problem on the other person 100% when actually he's also or she is also partly to blame. Yun lang ang caution ko palagi. Kaya ako, pag counseling talagang first day, pakikwentuhin ko lang yan na husto at makikinig ako. Tapos pag nakikita ko na merong points na pwede ko i-validate yung storya niya with the other person whom I will also contact in terms of his version or her version of the story, then, you can sort of triangulate between the narratives or the versions that you are presented with and kind of determine ano nga ba yung katotohanan.
Yes. Objectivity po is a skill.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, mental illness among Christians is a different story. Another story po is OFWs. Filipino workers. They do have, this is a very unique demographic po, no? Na they do have a very specific experience. So, for OFWs, they experience like infidelity, di po ba? It's either yung husband or wife in the Philippines or dito na nangyayari. Abusive employers, economic struggles po, no? Yung mga hindi napapasweldo ng matagal. And even for Christians, it would really, really cause problems. No? Overthinking and depression and all of those things. No? So, ano pa po, cultural issues po, like mahirap mag-cope sa ibang kultura to live among them, and syempre po yung distance sa pamilya, yung layo. And all of these things may cause mental problems po, no? So, what do you think are the mental needs of this very specific demographic po? And how do we address that?
To answer that question and also to connect with the earlier question, maybe starting with just being in touch with who we are, with how we're feeling, And then if you look up the Psalms, many of them are Psalms of like crying out to the Lord, please and cries, lament, yun talagang binubuhos yung pag-iisip nila, yung puso nila. Why so downcast, O my soul? Di ba? Meron ganun Psalm. Lord, where are you? Why have you forsaken me? Right? My enemies are after me. So okay lang na simulan natin dun sa as an OFW, na magkahiwalay kami sa family. Panginoon, hanggang kailan to? How long am I gonna suffer? When are we gonna be reunited as a family? Ganon. Tapos yung mga issues natin na ganyan na, katulad sa infidelity, of course, that's a very, deep wound of betrayal. Naghihirap ka na nga dito sa katatrabaho, tapos i-betray ka pa nung iniwanan mo sa Pilipinas na pinagkakatiwalaan mo, no? So these are deep, deep issues. So the first step is to actually, in relation to the earlier question, and then to answer your question, being in touch with ourselves, and saying that, Lord, opening ourselves to the Lord. Even Jesus himself, when I talked about the model of depression, he got his friends together. He gathered them together. How he coped with depression. He was close to death. He knew he was going to be dying. He was going to be crucified on the cross. That was God's will. He knew that, the Father's will for him. And yet, just like any human being, he suffered. He was emotionally, he was in distress. But what did he do? He gathered his friends together, his close friends. He poured his soul and his heart to them. Look, this is what I'm going through. Even if I am God, right? I mean, he knew he was God, but there's a human side of him that was suffering. So reach out to somebody. First of all, being in touch with our feelings. Reach out to somebody else, especially because you go through the same experiences. There is the power of, other people affirming exactly what you've gone through or what you are going through. Sometimes you don't even have to say anything. You just be with them. Alam na nila yan, iiyak ka lang. Kaya nga yung grupo ng mga babae, sabi ko sa mga churches, we should have a women's ministry where all you do is just cry. Naiintindihan mo na yan. Minsan sa counseling session ko, I remember this woman one time coming. She was crying because her son died from an accident, suddenly, unexpectedly. And what can you say to somebody who's grieving? Iyak lang siya ng iyak. And you know what I did? I just cried with her for almost an hour. But that was enough, yung presence ko. Ganon. So means yung community natin, church, we have a very strategic ministry. God has put us together. Wala nang ibang makakaintindi sa mga problema natin, iba-iba na yung mga problema natin, culturally, kayo dito yung mga OFWs, compared sa amin sa mga immigrants. Yung iba pareho din, minsan pareho din. Pero, what we have, the bottom line is that we have Jesus. And ultimate healing, comes from the Lord only, from God only. Of course, I see people change, but that change is only temporary. It's only when we have Jesus, our ultimate physician and healer, that we can be changed and really be restored, in that relationship with God.
Yes. I believe that's also what differentiates us Christians with mental problems with others, because we have the hope, and we have Jesus, and we have the Bible. Like, if I feel something wrong with me, I go to the narrative of Job. I go to the narrative of David. I go to different stories in the Bible so that I can relate because they underwent the same experience.
Yeah. Or of other Christians right now.
Of other Christians.
Minsan meron ako na-counsel, a client, that too long ago, kinuwento ko sa kanya yung mga big names, in different churches or, big names of pastors and what they went through. Medyo hindi siya makarelate. And then I open up. I don't usually open up, but she's also a Christian, about my personal life. And I open up to her about what I'm going through. Yung malaking problema ko, recently lang nangyari sa pandemic. Tapos alam mo, talagang nakarelate siya. Oh, thank you for sharing that with me. Miski pala ikaw, na psychologist, ang dami mo nang alam, nagsasuffer ka din. Nobody's exempt from all these sufferings, right? Because we live in a broken world. And this home is not our home. Talagang like, we're moaning and groaning for that time, that place in heaven, when there will be no more pain, sorrow, illnesses, mental health problems, emotional, broken relationships, and pain, and sin, Until then, we have all our moaning and groaning, kasi nagsasuffer tayo. Pero yung kliyente ko yun, nag-open up ako sa kanya, and I rarely do that. Tuwan-tuwa siya na, you know what, you also suffer. Ganun pala yun, no? So yung transparency natin sa isa't isa. Tayo, as believers. That is part of God's grace for us to comfort each other with the comfort by which God has comforted us. Di ba meron ganang Bible verse?
And I think, yes po, Pastor Jojo.
Yeah, I have been ministering to the Filipinos that have been scattered abroad for so many years. Mula nung binigyan ako ng Panginoon ng opportunities to travel abroad to more than 60 countries around the world. And this is what I've noticed for Filipinos. Kasi the moment they leave the Philippines, they are really bewildered because in the first place, as a resident in a particular culture, you are embedded in that culture. Yung roots mo nandun, no? And then pag umalis ka doon, you're actually uprooting yourself, from a culture that you are familiar with. And then you're going to a culture that is totally unknown or foreign, especially kung bagong salta ka sa lugar na yun. No? And then you have to establish yourself there. You have to manage to first acclimatize in terms of the weather. Pangalawa, culturally, you have to acculturate. No? Kasi iba yung lengguwahe, iba yung pagkain, iba yung mga makakasalimuha mo sa trabaho. No? And it's so drastic actually, and life-changing to a certain extent. And I think that probably the correct term here is yung ganung tao is in a liminal kind of transitional phase, from one culture to the other. So this aspect of being culturally, linguistically, kung iba yung salita doon sa lugar na pupuntahan niya, being bewildered or confused is a big process of even amplifying yung nararamdaman niya. Kasi in the first place, geographically distant na siya. Di ba? From his homeland. And not only that, from his family, his loved ones. No? Because if we were to define loneliness as the lack of intimacy on a horizontal level, with your loved ones, what more kung yung taong yun, wala pang intimacy sa Panginoon. No? So, meron siyang spiritual loneliness. Meron din siyang loneliness na yung sa level nung yung kung sino yung mga mahal niya sa buhay. No? So, yung infidelity dapat ma-frame natin in that kind of context. Kasi yung infidelity nag-a-arise yan mainly because, they are in a situation where they are so emotionally barren, hindi nadidiligan ng pagmamahal, as I would put it. And they feel this very, very acutely, And one way of assuaging this is to enter into another relationship, however risky this may be. In fact, some Filipinos would even say, never mind kung may pamilya ako sa Pilipinas, dito sa Middle East, if I have the means, pwede naman ako maging Muslim dito, magkaroon ako ng 3, 4 na asawa para hindi ako masyado malumbay, di ba? And this has happened, in fact. No? So, yun po dapat ang pag-iintindi natin. Tapos, unang-una, yung isa pa na very critical, yung kanyang faith system. No? Kung Katoliko yan, o evangelical, o hindi naniniwala sa Diyos. No? So, iba-iba yung moral frames of reference nila, hindi ba? So, they are, of course, oftentimes shifting in terms of the kind of values they have. No? Is it right for me to go out with this person? Or is it right to pursue an illicit relationship? Kasi alam niya, may pamilya siya. And of course, all this adds up, to impacting his psyche, his emotions, his physical well-being. So, ang dami pong impluensya sa OFW that are very, very peculiar na dapat nating i-factor in pag tinitignan natin isang taong nagkakaroon ng mental health illness or being spiritually unwell, so to speak. So, dapat unawain nating mabuti yung taong yun. And that, of course, requires patience, it requires time, it requires understanding, and most of all, it requires love, compassion, identifying with the person, kung ano yung kanyang problema. And tayo bilang Kristiyano, anong konkretong pwede nating gawin, doon? Kung Kristiyano yun, na bagong salta, mabuti nga kung immediately i-channel natin sa isang simbahan na Bible-believing, na may kapatiran, na magiging support group niya. But what about the Filipinos na walang support group? Di ba? Kawawa naman talaga sila. And so, these are the Filipinos that eventually end up being very, mentally, spiritually disturbed because they make what I would call spiritually hazardous choices. Choices that they would regret later. But they are doing that because sila ay nalulumbay, and therefore, ganun ang gagawin nila. They will reach out to somebody who's also married and then makikipag-relasyon sila sa taong yon, And then pag uwi nila sa Pilipinas, parang dead man lang sila na, meron silang second family actually dito. So it's a very complex situation, no? When we look at OFWs, and we need all the discernment, all the understanding we can to be able to minister to them, especially with the Word of God, and touch them with the love of the Lord Jesus.
There's another group of OFWs, and I tend to sort of compare with the immigrants, those who were born here. It's actually an educational experience for me to be in the Middle East for the first time and meet young people who were born here. Of course, if you had couples who raised family here, some of them, like 18 years old, 19 years old, or even younger, and then how do they transition between Filipino culture? They were raised here. Now they're going back to the Philippines to study. Doon sila magka-college, di ba? Tapos yung culture dito sa Middle East, medyo iba din yan. Parang katulad nung case din namin ng mga immigrants na mga bata sa US. Doon na pinanganak, doon na lumaki. Yung iba hindi na makatagalog, Tapos pag uwi sa Pilipinas, well, even in the US or miski dito sa Middle East siguro, they're not completely, of course, they're not identified as Arabic, right? As part of the mainstream community. Dito nga medyo malinaw pa yun, no? But when they go back to the Philippines, they're not completely Filipinos. So how do you help them transition to that? We're sort of like living in two worlds, in between. Almost like, and Pastor Georgia can say more about that, almost like we as Christians, we live in this world. We're in this world, but not of this world, So how do we live that kind of life where eventually we know we're citizens of heaven rather than of earth, and yet we are here. So siguro nga yung natin as OFWs or as immigrants, na lumaki sa ibang culture, tapos uuwi sa Pilipinas, o kaya tayo rin na mga medyo adults na, kahit lumaki tayo sa Pilipinas, nandito sa ibang culture, how do you navigate that? So maybe that's another issue, for your church, sa mga youth group nyo, o sa mga women's ministry, or for the counselors, pastors, to consider,
I believe the term po, Doc, is third culture kids po yung tawag po yata sa
okay,
kanila.
parang gano'n. Meron silang ibang culture na hindi talaga, neither here nor there.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
So, for another question po, for the sake of proper definition po, Doc, because the words depression or anxiety, they have become such household terms na a person can easily claim for him or herself na I am a depressed person, even without consulting a doctor or walang check-up from a psychologist or someone who knows it, who knows or has the expertise about it. No, we can easily say na I have anxiety problems, I have panic disorder, ganyan po. So how do we fix that problem for proper definition po?
Yeah.
How can one define himself as having depressive disorder?
Yeah. So I think in my lecture, the first time, seminar that I held, I talked about depression and anxiety. There are different types of depression. There are different types of anxiety. But we have what we call the Bible of therapists, psychotherapists, psychologists, master's level therapists, psychiatrists, where we have what we call Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The latest version is 5, which was developed in 2013. So we have to meet certain symptoms, criteria. Hindi common na nalulungkot ako, depressed na ako.
Yes.
I'm feeling down, depressed na ako. Tapos nag-worry ako kung if you have enough money, anxious na ako. Hindi ganun kasimple, We have to look at different types of depression. It may be something related to hormonal changes, premenstrual dysphoric, depression. Or it can be like anxiety, that's social anxiety sa mga bata. Uso din yan, nagsisimula yan around age 13. When kids have difficulty socializing with others. And then eventually it can become a problem as they get older. So iba-ibang klase, specific phobias, it's another kind of anxiety. Tapos sa depression then and anxiety, it can be medication or substance-induced. Sometimes, just drinking coffee can cause anxiety, but you have to have a certain level, cutoff. 8 cups of coffee a day, that would really make a person experience anxiety symptoms. So, hindi ganun kasimple na oh, nalulungkot ako, oh, nag-worry ako, meron akong anxiety, meron akong depression, you know. So one of the hallmarks, you know, we look at is, what are your symptoms? So when I see somebody, you know, what I usually would do in my mind, I have the criteria for major depressive disorder. Out of the 9 symptoms and signs, I would, in my mind, go through different symptoms. Generally, in depression, major depressive disorder, it's not just emotional changes, feeling sad. It would include cognitive changes, forgetfulness. It can include bodily, somatic changes and symptoms such as, you know, inability to sleep or oversleeping, you know, insomnia or hypersomnia, or weight gain can be losing weight or gaining weight. So that would be involving our emotions, involving our body, involving our thoughts, forgetfulness, you know, cognitive changes. And of course, feelings of worthlessness or guilt, and suicidal ideations, attempts, you know, serious attempts. That's always assessed as part of depression. But the main thing is, how long has it been going on? So that's one other criteria. These symptoms, after you've met at least 5 of them, and a certain specific time, at least 2 weeks, continuously. And is it affecting your functioning? Is there impairment in your functioning, whether as a student, you know, as a worker, or even as a stay-at-home mom? Hindi mo na maalagaan yung mga anak mo, you know, hindi ka na makagising sa umaga, ganon, parang wala kang motivation to do things. So it's not just a depressed mood, you know, it's also losing interest in things that you used to do or you were able to do, you know, in the past. So pag dumating na dyan, you really need professional help. So siguro, to answer your question, pagka medyo may nagsasabi na, oy, ganito yung depressed yata ako or anxious ako, medyo kausapin nyo lang sa group nyo, no? And as a church, I'm sure you would have like a counseling team, you know, or the pastor that would sit down with that person and then assess, ano ba talaga nangyayari? Now that I've given you some tools, you know, paano makikita yan, then consider those things. Tapos pag dumating na dun sa line na, you know, hindi na ako makapagtrabaho, hindi na ako makapasok sa school, I'm feeling suicidal, then you just need professional help. Tapos meron din akong binigay sa inyo nun, I think yung COVID Coach, that's a good app, you know, where you can actually monitor, even young people, you go through stress management, and then you can monitor your emotions on a 2-week basis, for example. Just answer those questions, you know, and then i-record yan sa phone nyo. Tapos makikita yung changes. Ganon din sa depression. Because those are the 2 most common emotional problems, depression and anxiety.
I think this is where we should educate also our congregations to, you know, do their part. At ganun din yung ating mga kapwa leaders na tulungan ka. So that if they can make themselves available in terms of counseling, teaching, preaching, malaking tulong yun.
So I'll paraphrase us. There is a God-shaped vacuum in each of us, in our hearts. It's God-shaped, and only God can fill that void.
That distinction is blurred, you know. That is where people, especially young people, fall into the trap